All right, Gesundheit. So what I want to get into here is the evolution of life histories. And you can think of an organism's life history as its total budget. You know, every organism has a finite amount of resources and energy available to it, and it can choose to spend those on, well, an organism can spend energy on acquiring more energy, like hunting for food. It can spend energy on defense. It can spend energy on building shelter, maybe. It can spend money on, reproduction. Well, not really money, but resources and all those things. And as with a real monetary budget, there's never enough. I'll come back to a guy named Richard Dawkins. He's not really, I mean, he's a very smart man. He's not really known for original research. He's primarily known as a synthesizer and popularizer. And that's okay, there's plenty of room for that. He came up with the idea of what he calls a Darwinian demon. And a Darwinian demon is an imaginary organism. And Darwinian demons, if they existed, would be born sexually mature. So they would be reproducing from the very beginning of their lives. They would continuously produce offspring. The offspring would all be total badasses of very high quality. And a Darwinian demon would live forever. Now, the reason these are hypothetical is that no such organism can exist for simple laws of physics and chemistry. You don't have infinite resources. You don't have infinite energy. An organism that could reproduce that fast would exhaust its ecosystem very, very quickly. And limits like that force organisms to make trade-offs. And it is similar in some respects to design. Although we don't invoke a designer in evolutionary biology, there are still some interesting parallels. If you think about choosing a car, the ideal car would do 500 miles an hour and have safety features that made that absolutely safe, and have, you know, ejector seats that would eject you out of any crash and you would float down to the accompaniment of soft music. And it would get 500 miles per gallon and it would never break down. Right? Yes? That would be totally awesome. Oh, and it would also cost 15 cents. So 15 cents for a car that goes 500 miles an hour, gets 500 miles on 1 gallon of gas. It's also a hybrid, so it can run indefinitely on electricity and you don't have to buy gas at all. So completely safe in a crash that it never kills anybody and nobody ever dies. Okay. Obviously that can't exist and we have to find a compromise, but different people will have different compromises. There are cases where you want a fast car, even if it gets poor mileage. In other cases, like now, you probably want a car with very, very good gas mileage, even if it doesn't accelerate really fast and doesn't look particularly sexy. Or you might want a vehicle that can carry, for some things, you want a vehicle that carries lots of cargo, even if it's not fast and it doesn't get great gas mileage. Different people have different needs. So different people buy different cars, and every car model is a compromise that can't optimize everything. You can never get a car that is awesome at everything you would ever want a car to do simultaneously, right? So you always trade off. Yes? Organisms evolve in a similar way. since they've only got a finite amount of energy and resources available, organisms have to allocate those resources. Organisms that spend a lot of energy on reproducing may not be able to spend a lot of energy on longevity. Organisms that spend a lot of energy on defense may not have a lot of resources to spend on reproduction, and so on. So there's always trade-offs that organisms make as they evolve. And the study of how organisms make these trade-offs is life history theory. And in life history theory, we often talk about what's called the fast-slow continuum. There are organisms that may develop very rapidly, have a very short lifespan, but reproduce like crazy. A lot of insects might do this. I mean, mosquitoes do not live particularly long, but they develop within, what, a week from egg to adult, and they can reproduce quite rapidly, as I trust you recognize living in Arkansas, as we all do, where the mosquito is the state bird. I'm kidding, it's the mockingbird, but you know, what it should be is the Tyson chicken. But anyhow, on the other hand, you can have organisms that may develop much more slowly, don't reproduce very rapidly, but have a very long lifespan. And you can certainly have organisms in the middle, but there are some combinations you can't have, like fast development, long lifespan, and high reproductive rate would basically be a Darwinian demon. So there are some possibilities that evolution can't reach. You know, just as there are some imaginary models of cars that we will never be able to engineer. Like the one that gets 500 miles to the gallon and carries about 10 tons of load and goes 500 miles an hour and costs 15 cents and looks incredibly sexy, even if you put fuzzy dice on it. Right. Just as you'll never get a car with that combination of features, there are some combinations of features that evolution can't give you. And we call that an evolutionary constraint. An evolutionary constraint is simply a limit on what it is possible for evolution to create. There are some things that evolution will never evolve because they directly violate physical law. You'll never get an organism that runs faster than light, right? Yes, because you know nothing can be faster than the speed of light in a vacuum. There are some, or somebody claims, this was years ago, that they measured an insect, I think it was a deer botfly, flying at 800 miles an hour. And someone else pointed out that an insect that could fly that fast would burn up its entire body weight every second. And yeah, there are no insects that really do fly that fast because, again, you get the laws of physics and chemistry get in the way. There's other types of constraints, what we call historical constraints. If evolution took one path, it may never be able to go back and do something completely different. Some things evolved so long ago that they're woven so deeply into, you know, the fabric of an organism that that it's not really possible to go back and alter those. An example, we evolved bones. No, is that a good example? Okay. There was a claim a while back that somebody had found some bacteria that were not using phosphorus in their metabolism. They were using arsenic. I think that's right. And arsenic is in the same column as phosphorus in the periodic table. I'm pretty sure it is. Yeah, pretty sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
That in
What's that?
Talking about that paper that one girl wrote.
Yeah, she discovered these arsenic bacteria supposedly living in Mono Lake, California. And that would be really, really awesome. But for a number of reasons, it turns out that it's extremely unlikely that what she claimed really existed, simply because life has been using phosphorus for 4 billion years of its existence. And it's just not the kind of thing that you could easily replace with anything different. It is possible that life using arsenic could exist. Maybe it did exist 4 billion years ago. For whatever reason, life got on the phosphorus track. And it's now thought to be pretty much impossible for life to go back. It's just become too fundamental a feature. So there are physical constraints, and then what I just gave you is a historical constraint. Getting back to that list of the fast-slow continuum, here's two ends of it. The turquoise killifish at the top. I'll dim the light so you can see that, because this is a really rather attractive fish. Nothobrachus furtzeri. In the wild, I think it lives in Africa. I have to look that up, but I'm pretty sure it's Africa. But if memory serves, it lives in ponds that have a way of drying up. And I think its eggs are able to, if eggs get down in the mud, they can survive drying up and then come back to life when the pond refills. I think this is a fish that can do that. But clearly, in that environment, as soon as a fish is hatched, it doesn't have any time to waste if its environment is in danger of waking up. So Nothobrachus furtzeri can complete its life cycle from egg to adult to eggs again in 14 days. That's the fastest vertebrate life cycle known. In the wild, they can live 1 to 5 months. I'm not sure how long they live in aquariums, but their life cycle is pretty intensely speeded up. 2 weeks is, again, that's the fastest vertebrate that we've got. They are actually a target of some research interests. There are people that are interested in figuring out how they've managed to evolve such an incredibly short life cycle that might have ultimately relevance to research in extending human lifespans. On the other hand, down there below, that's a Greenland shark. And we could sing the song, but it would have to be extremely slow. Greenland shark, do, 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 do. Greenland shark. I'll stop. But they can take over 150 years to reach sexual maturity, and they live for over 400 years. They're candidates for the longest lived vertebrates. So here we've got, short lifespan, but rapid in, reproduction in the turquoise killifish, and then very slow growth and slow reproduction, but long lifespan in the case of the Greenland shark. And of course, most species are somewhere in between. Humans are fairly slow, although not nearly as slow as the shark. Hamsters would be quite a bit faster, although not as fast as the killifish. What's the lifespan of a hamster? I think it's 1 year, right? Hamsters basically exist in order to teach first grade classes about death. Okay, right. So yeah, turquoise killifish live in these temporary pools in Zimbabwe. I was right, they're in Africa. Greenland shark's environment is much lower energy. I mean, it's Greenland, they're living in deep Arctic waters, but we think their habitat is also a lot more stable. The deep ocean off the coast of Greenland is not in risk of drying up suddenly anytime soon. The turquoise killifish, on the other hand, it is. And now something I have to talk about that is absolutely horrible and is going to haunt you. Way back when I was talking about, we were talking about natural theology. And I mentioned, Paley's idea that the entire created world showed evidence not just that a designer existed, but that he was kind, loving, and merciful. Basically everything that we learned in Sunday school. And a counter argument to this is, if that's the case, why do we have so much pain, cruelty, and horror in the natural world? Ultimately, I've got no answer for that. You've got to figure it out. But in case anybody was feeling too comfortable when I talked about engineering and design and trade-offs and things like that, consider the life cycle of the Australian marsupial mice. Remember that one of the things Darwin noted was this weird way in which Australian mammals look like but aren't mammals found elsewhere in the world. So they don't have flying squirrels, they've got sugar gliders, they don't have moles, they have marsupial moles. They don't have anteaters, they have marsupial numbats, and they have these marsupial mice. And they're not really mice, they are marsupials. They give birth to these very underdeveloped, basically practically fetuses that crawl into a pouch and develop there, technically outside the mother's body. Okay, in Australia, where antechinus live, there's one huge seasonal sedge in the population of the insects that antechinus feeds on. Okay, sorry about the accent. And antechinus have pretty large litters. And even though they're born at a very underdeveloped stage, they latch right onto nipples and they grow rapidly, which means mommy has to provide lots of nutrition in the form of milk. And providing milk for any mammal is a very, very, very big investment of energy. I mean, it is for humans too. Jared Diamond worked out that a mother nursing twins is going through as much calories as a soldier in basic training. I can certainly tell you that when my wife would feed our son when he was a baby, it would just knock her right out. She'd go right to sleep. It was tiring. It doesn't look like it's work, but physiologically it is. So antechinus has these big litters and has to provide a lot of milk. And it so happens that in Australia, every year, there's one great big seasonal surge in the insect population. So there's about 1 month in the parts of Australia where antechinus live, where there's a humongous amount of potential food. And so in order to reproduce, antechinus females have to bear offspring right at the time of the surge, right? If they bore offspring at any time of year, there might not be enough food for mama to make milk for all of the babies. So that means that birth has to take place within this very narrow time window. It also means that mating has to take place in a very narrow time window. You have to synchronize births, you have to synchronize the mating. This puts some interesting constraints on antechinus males. Because male antechinus build up enormous reserves of sperm. And when the mating season begins, the males stop eating and they start mating continuously, hours at a time, for 3 weeks. That might sound like a lot of fun. I mean, there's any number of pop songs about the joys of, doing it all night. It's not fun because the males not only stop eating, they crank up the sex hormones up to 11. So they're just, walking bundles of testosterone. They crank up the stress hormones like crazy. And they divert so much energy to reproduction that they shut down their own immune systems. Meaning that after about 3 weeks, this is a male after 3 weeks of continuous mating, completely exhausted, fur is falling out, they're developing gangrene, right? They're literally rotting alive and still trying to mate. You know, as they are dying, they are still trying to mate. There's absolutely nothing else they can do. So yeah, this is not Marvin Gaye. This is more like Cannibal Corpse. Antechinus, by the way, there's several species of Antechinus and a few species in one related genus that does much the same thing. They're the only mammals that are what we call semilparous. I'll go back a couple. It's down there at the bottom, semilparous mammals. Most mammals are iteroparous, I-T-E-R-O parous, meaning that they mate repeatedly over the course of a lifespan. But Antechinus are semilparous, so are many species of Pacific salmon, right? We've heard of the salmon. They're born in these streams, they drift downstream to the ocean, they mature, and then they migrate back upstream. Right? You have heard of this? Okay. Salmon are semilparous, so are typical squid and octopus. The reason why octopus have not killed us all is because they can't really develop culture because mommy octopus has died by the time her eggs hatch. So octopi aren't able to transmit information from one generation to the next. If they did, humanity's toast. They're really smart. Right. And then these are the only semilparous mammals, Antechinus and a couple of related species that all do this. And it's horrifying. You know, towards the end, the males are basically, you know, the walking dead, still trying to get it on. And the females live a little bit longer. They will reproduce, they'll have their babies. Hopefully the babies survive to adulthood, and in the wild, mommy dies too, soon after the babies are big enough to go off on their own. So the lifespan's very short. In zoos, I think you can keep them alive for longer than this, but in the wild, they don't live much longer than 1 year. And, you know, the way that the males meet their end is like something out of a horror movie, and yet it makes sense. It's adaptive. This is what Antechinus has evolved to do in sync with an Australian climate cycle that produces this annual enormous surge of insects, and then for exactly 1 month out of 12. An Australian scientist named Diana Fisher, by the way, has shown that there's several Antechinus species, and the ones in the tropics have a more steady food supply, and in those species, sometimes the males survive. The extreme type of life cycle is not as extreme in the tropical species. It's most extreme in the grassland parts of Australia, and that's where the food supply varies more sharply. So we have this extreme life cycle, but we have variations on it, and the variations are correlated with where the Antechinus lives. Species where there's a more steady food supply, the males will sometimes survive the mating season and I think live to mate again. And it turns out that in Antechinus species where the males always die, males have significantly larger testes. You're looking there at, on the x-axis, that's the natural log of body weight in grams against the natural log of scrotal width. And in the species where the males always die, those are shown in black circles. And species where the males sometimes survive are shown in open circles. And there is a bit of scatter, but that short line among the black circles, you know, is above the longer line That is the correlation among the open circles. What this is showing you is that in the species where antechinus gets only one shot, the males presumably have been selected to put as much energy as possible into growing, cranking out as much sperm as they can, building these noticeably larger testicles. Testicle size is a pretty good marker for how many sperm a mammal can produce. And males with big testes produce more sperm. If you're think of it this way, if you are an antechinus in the grasslands, you have this one surge of food and then nothing. You get exactly one shot to reproduce. And you're like Alexander Hamilton, I am not throwing away my shot. I am not throwing away my shot. That's a musical. Anybody heard of it? Soon they forget. If you are an antechinus where the food supply is more even, you are likely to get more chances than just the one at mating. So you don't have to direct quite so much energy into building up freakishly large testicles. You can allocate more energy to other aspects of life, like surviving after the mating season, and ultimately get second chances. So you don't have to, you don't have to gamble everything on one single strategy. And so you can afford to allocate energy to other things away from growing freakishly large testes. Am I making sense there? All right, just remember that in this class, I am the tester. And that makes you, yes. Okay. There are cases where there's no single strategy that always works. And there are times when you get traits that are called polymorphic, or in this case, dimorphic, where selection may not favor any single phenotype, but may actually favor two different ones that may work best in different settings. That's the sand field cricket along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast of the US. They're all one species, but some individuals are short-winged. That's a short-winged cricket right there. And the short-winged crickets cannot disperse very well. They can't really fly. Other crickets of this species are long-winged. The difference is due to inheritance at multiple loci. There's no single gene for wing length, but it is genetic. There's a long-winged cricket up there at the top. These guys allocate more to locomotion. They've got long wings, they've got stronger flight muscles. And if conditions are bad, they can disperse. They can disperse to new habitats. The trade-off is they've got less energy available for reproduction, so gonads develop slowly. Down below, short-winged crickets have larger gonads. They invest more energy in reproduction, but they can't disperse. I don't think they can fly, or if they can, they don't do it nearly as well. So again, we've got different members of the same species may have different life history strategies, different patterns of allocating resources. Some people put, like, can't you do this in video games? Like, you put some of your points into physical strength and some of your points into armor, and then that decides whether you're going to be a healer or a tank or a wizard or whatever it is. Okay, all right. Sorry, my idea of a really good video game is in a very tall cabinet, takes quarters, and is all about this little yellow mouth that goes running through a maze chased by ghosts. It's a good game, it's really cool, Anyway, so yeah, just as you might invest your points to decide whether you're going to be a tank, a healer, a wizard, a Leroy Jenkins, whatever it is, organisms can evolve to invest their points in analogous ways. Since I've mentioned sex a lot, one might be wondering, a lot of life history theory revolves around sex. And you might be wondering, what on earth is the point of sex? I certainly have wondered that many times in my career, mostly in high school. But completely aside from that, and those cheerleaders that would never even look at me, a guy named John Maynard Smith, one of the grand old men of evolutionary bio, pointed out something that he called the twofold cost of sex. And it goes like this. Imagine that you've got a population with some individuals that are sexual and some that are asexual. And you can actually get that in certain snails. You can find it in plants. Dr. Noyes has actually worked on a population of flowering plants that has both asexually reproducing and sexually reproducing individuals in the same population. Every asexual is able to reproduce, right? Because they can just, bud off offspring, or some asexual species produce eggs, but the eggs are just automatically fertile and they don't need a sperm. That's called parthenogenesis. So every member of an asexual species can reproduce. Sexuals have to pair up. All right? You only need one asexual to have a baby, but you need two sexuals. And the upshot of that is that if you had a population of sexuals and asexuals, the asexuals ought to outcompete the sexuals because they can reproduce twice as fast. Right? Am I making sense there? Yeah. So why is it that sexual reproduction is so popular? Sexual reproduction also carries cost with it. You have to allocate energy towards seeking a mate. You may have to allocate resources towards producing gametes. You may have to allocate resources towards providing the mate with resources, or fighting off rivals or something like that. Finding a mate can be, a big time drain on your resources. Insert punchline here. You also have the risk that an organism that mingles its genes with a partner might produce offspring with a genotype that is less fit. If you've already got a well-adapted genotype, there's a risk that if you mingle those genes with somebody else, the offspring won't have your perfect combination, and they will, on average, have a less fit genotype. So you'd think asexual reproduction might be favored, and yes, certainly in the animal kingdom, there are very few organisms that never reproduce sexually. There's a fair number that can switch it. There's a fair number that might reproduce asexually at one stage in the life cycle and sexually in another. But there are very few that never reproduce sexually. And when we find them, very often they are basically close and probably recently evolved relatives of sexual species. So there's a number of asexual species of things like Nematophorus, whip-tailed lizards, that are all female and reproduced by parthenogenesis. Mom just produces fertile eggs without needing a sperm. But the asexual whip-tailed lizards are always close relatives of sexual species and probably did not evolve that long ago. So why is sexual reproduction so universal in the animal kingdom and so very common even in the plant kingdom? It turns out there's a number of benefits for it. I'll bring the lights up. one very definite benefit is it breaks up what we call linkage disequilibrium. I did not go into this in the population genetics part because we can simulate this mathematically. It's probably more trouble than you really felt like going through. But linkage disequilibrium is what you get when selection on alleles of one gene alters the allele frequencies at a different gene. And there's several ways that this can happen, but probably the simplest is physical linkage. You guys do remember genetic linkage, right? Genes are located on chromosomes, yes? And sometimes genes can be very close together. And when that happens, there's a high probability they will be inherited as a unit, right? And that probability goes down the farther they are away, because the farther they are away, the more likely that crossing over will separate them. You do remember this? Okay. Imagine that a gene for, let's just say, blue eyes in humans happen to be, okay, let's say that a gene for eye color in humans happen to be located on a chromosome right next to a gene for some kind of body odor. And imagine that the allele for blue eyes happen to be right next to an allele for extremely foul, cheese stuffed in gym shoes for a week, body odor. Okay, with me there so far? We might well expect that the frequency of blue eyes in a population would go down, not because blue eyes are being selected against, but because the gene for blue eyes happens to be physically right next to a gene for body odor so foul that nobody wants to get within 50 feet of it. Okay, am I making sense there? So we'd be having selection against horrible body odor, but at the same time, that would drag down the frequency of the blue-eyed allele, even though blue eyes are not being selected against at all in this case. Okay, that's what we call linkage disequilibrium, when selection at one locus affects allele frequencies at a different locus. Sexual reproduction breaks up linkage disequilibrium. If you strip sexual reproduction down to its absolute basics, it's genetic engineering. You take some of your DNA and you mingle it with another organism's DNA, and you produce something with a different combination of DNA than you had before. Right? Yes? You're right. All of the chocolates and the flowers and Tinder is just kind of window dressing on that. When you reproduce sexually, you're genetically engineering. And part of that genetic engineering is crossing over in meiosis. You do remember how that goes? Again, if you're a little fuzzy on it, please make sure that you go back and pick it up. Anyway, that crossing over and the recombination that you do in sexual reproduction breaks up linkage disequilibrium. Think about it. Let's say you had a gene for great physical strength and a gene for hideous body odor that were linked. All right, great physical strength might be a great survival advantage, but hideous body odor might not be. If you reproduce sexually, you at least have a chance of getting some offspring that have the gene for great physical strength and not the gene for heinous body odor, right? Sexual reproduction shuffles your genetic deck, and organisms can be created that have new combinations of genes, making it much easier for favorable traits to be selected for and unfavorable ones to be selected against. Okay. With me there so far? Okay, so sex is great because it breaks up linkage disequilibrium. A second great advantage of sex is that it breaks up Mueller's ratchet. Now, Hermann Mueller was a Russian guy, although he was of German ancestry, and a pioneer in early genetics. He was one of the first to show that mutations result from direct physical damage to a chromosome. In particular, he showed that X-rays physically damage chromosomes, and that damage is correlated with genetic mutations. Okay, with me there. A ratchet is a toothed wheel that can only turn in one direction. Like if you've ever used a socket wrench, you're familiar with a ratchet, because when you have a handle and you put a socket on there, you can push the handle in one direction without turning the socket. But if you pull the handle in the other direction, you have no choice but for the socket to move with the handle. Right? Yes? That's a ratchet, a toothed wheel that's only allowed to turn in one direction. Mueller's ratchet is the tendency of an asexual line to accumulate more and more mutations. There's always a risk of mutation whenever you duplicate DNA. You contain something on the order of 50 mutations, changes in your DNA sequence that were not present in either one of your parents. We're all mutants. The vast majority of us are not the kind of mutants that can shoot optic blast out their eyes, but we are in fact all mutants, even if we're not all X-Men. Mueller pointed out that in an asexual population, those mutations will constantly accumulate. It's a little bit like making a photocopy, right? Every time you make a photocopy, it might be really clear, but there's always going to be a little bit of distortion and a little bit of, flecks and scratches and things like that. Yes? Right? So what happens when you make a photocopy of that photocopy? Well, the second photocopy will copy all of the little flecks and distortions on the first photocopy and then add some new ones. And then what happens if you make a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy? Well, the same thing. The third one will still have all of the distortions of the first two and then add more. And if you do this by about 10 copies, you have something completely unreadable. The same was true back in the days when people used to trade cassette tapes. There was this awesome band back in the day called the Grateful Dead, and they actually allowed people to tape their shows. So pretty much every concert they ever played, there are audio tapes of that concert that used to circulate among fans. Like people would bring professional recording equipment, and there was a special space where they could set up. And yeah, virtually every concert got recorded. And people would trade tapes, say, hey man, I didn't get to the July 23rd, 1977 one in Nassau, New York. I said, hey man, I got a tape of that one, I'll trade it to you. And the problem was that every time you copy a tape, the copy has a little bit more noise on it than the original does, right? Every time you copy a tape, you add just a little bit of, white noise and, clicks and bleeps and bloops. And by the time you had about a 10th generation cassette tape of a Grateful Dead show, you couldn't really hear very much. Yeah, the Dead, by the way, were kind of the first jam band. And then one of the first bands to have this army of followers that would just wander the country, going to show after show, living in Volkswagen vans and, trying to earn enough money for a ticket by selling pot brownies in the parking lot. It was a pretty good scene. Right, anyway. Yeah, check them out. So whenever you copy information, you always have a risk of introducing distortion. And every time you copy DNA, you're going to add mutations. And if you have a lineage that is purely asexual, every time it reproduces, there is a risk that it will add mutations. Some of those mutations are going to be bad for it. So DNA copy quality, we predict, would slowly, maybe not in the first generation, but slowly degrade. Sexual reproduction means that if you have a mutation that's not good for you, you have at least a chance of having offspring that don't have that mutation. In fact, a leading theory for why sexual reproduction evolved in the first place is as a DNA repair mechanism among the earliest prokaryotes alive on Earth. That if you have a mutation, you can mingle your DNA with somebody who doesn't have a mutation and hopefully have offspring that are not passing that same mutation on. So Mueller's ratchet, you're thinking of adding mutations as a ratchet. That's a wheel that only turns one way. Yes, right? Mueller's ratchet is this tendency to accumulate negative mutations. Sexual reproduction breaks the ratchet. It allows organisms to get rid of negative mutations. Finally, sex generates variability. Asexual organisms pretty much look exactly like the parent. Organisms produced by sexual reproductions vary because you're cutting up DNA and shuffling it. And that is beneficial in itself, especially if the population is exposed to environments that are changing, environments that are variable, or if it's exposed to pathogens or parasites. I'm almost done for now, but this guy's named Lee Van Valen. He was at University of Chicago, and he devised something called the Red Queen hypothesis. Let me advance one slide to show you why it's called that. Lewis Carroll wrote the book Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I'm sure you've seen it at some point. Disney made a movie out of it. And if you've seen the movie, you know that Alice in Wonderland encounters all these strange characters that are derived from a pack of cards, right? She runs into the Queen of Hearts and the King of Hearts and all of those soldiers that fold themselves to make croquet arches. Anybody remember that part? Okay. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland take place in part in this really weird, well, it's all a dream, but part of the dream is this journey through this very surreal realm where a deck of cards have come to life. He wrote a sequel called Through the Looking Glass that takes place in a game of chess where the pieces have all come to life. And Alice encounters the Red Queen because in chess sets at the time, the pieces were white and red instead of being white and black. And there's this, and very strange things happen. It's all a dream. It doesn't make a great deal of logical sense, and it's not supposed to. And there's this bit where Alice is talking with the Red Queen. She's a pawn, and the Red Queen suddenly starts running and tells Alice to hang on, and they start running as fast as they can. And when they come to a stop, Alice looks around and notices that the scenery has not changed at all. And Alice says, you know, when I run, I usually get to someplace different. And the Red Queen says, basically, that's stupid. Now here you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. Van Valen's Red Queen hypothesis has that name for that reason. He hypothesized that the main thing that's driving evolution is ecological interactions among species. Every species has competitors. Every species has symbionts, including parasites. Every species has pathogens. Every species has other organisms that might disrupt it in some way. Every species is interacting in thousands of ways, positive, negative, and neutral, with all the other species in its ecosystem. Yes? Okay. So the idea there is that every time one species adapts, all of the other species in its ecosystem have to adapt. Let's say we've just got insects and plants. If one plant evolves a new chemical defense to keep the insects from eating it, the insects now have to evolve some sort of countermeasure to keep from being poisoned by it. And then the plant might have to evolve, I don't know, spikes on the leaves to make it harder for the insects to eat it, which means that some insect is now going to evolve harder mouth parts, or maybe the plant will evolve sticky latex to glue the insect's mouth shut, but then the insects will evolve techniques to cut the latex vessels. If you don't know, I've just described Dr. Desord's research because that's what he works on. And so every species constantly has to adapt just to hang on to the niche space that it's got. So our plant may have just evolved chemical defenses against the insects, but now all of a sudden there's a soil fungus that's causing it trouble, and it has to adapt to defend against the soil fungus. That takes energy away from reproducing, so it can't produce as many flowers. So it adapts in some other way to try to increase seed production and so on. The idea is that a species constantly has to change just to hold what it has, just to keep one step ahead of all of its competitors, parasites, pathogens, and predators. And to maintain that capacity for change, you have to maintain variability. And sex is a way to maintain variability. If you're cranking out organisms that are not exactly like you, you increase the odds that at least some of them are going to have some combination of genes that's going to be favored in a rapidly changing environment. And here was a test of this back in the early 200s. A team of people studied a New Zealand freshwater snail. And in this particular species, sexuals and asexuals coexist in the same population. What you need to know here is that snails are attacked by parasites. They're attacked by flukes. Flukes are a variety of parasitic flatworm. And fluke larvae will burrow into a snail, go through several changes inside the snail, and then burst out. And this doesn't kill the snail, but what it usually does is destroy the snail's gonads. It's not that uncommon for parasites to shrink or destroy their host's gonads. It's called parasitic castration. And so if you are in a snail population that is subject to these parasites, if you get hit by a parasite and the parasite eats your gonads, from the point of view of natural selection, you might as well be dead, right? I mean, you're still alive, but you can't reproduce if the flukes have eaten your testes. So the cool thing is that in some lakes in New Zealand, some of those lakes have high populations of flukes. Some lakes do not have flukes in them. Okay, so some lakes have these parasites and some lakes don't. Some lakes have, and lakes have different proportions of sexual and asexual snails. The map on the left looks like New Zealand has been stuck with a whole bunch of pins. The head of each one of those pins is a tiny pie chart showing you the frequency of males. And some of those lollipops are entirely blue. Those are populations that are entirely asexual. And the ones that have white wedges in them have sexual populations. And Lively et al. Showed that in lakes where the infection rate was high, the frequency of males was also high. in lakes that didn't have any in lakes that didn't have any of these parasites, males were very rare. So in environments where there are no parasites, asexual reproduction is not so bad, because again, asexuals can outcompete sexuals because they can breed faster, right? On the other hand, where you've got parasites, you need genetic variability as a defense. Put it this way. Imagine everybody in this class, your Cub account and your computers all had the same password, and it was password, and it never changed. One hacker, once he gets into one of your systems, can get into all the others anytime he wants to. Yes? Now imagine that everybody has different passwords and they are all randomly switched around. Like every 3 weeks, you have to change half the letters in your password. Okay, let's say we did something like that. Now, if a hacker cracks into one person's computer, the hacker is not going to be able to crack into everybody else's. Right? Yes? It's the same thing with parasites, although in parasites, instead of passwords, read, things like ability to recognize host protein molecules. Read, all of the molecular crosstalk that has to go on when a parasite penetrates a host. So if you have a population of snails in which everybody is variable and future generations are different from previous ones because they're generating this variability through sex, it is much harder for a parasite to spread. Because instead of all having identical recognition molecules in their cells, they're going to have different ones, like a bunch of students that all have different passwords. Some more recent work on the same snail. And yeah, they have a t-shirt in that lab. They're practicing asexual harassment. They're harassing asexual snails, I suppose. What that shows is the asexual lineages accumulate mutations at about twice the rate of the sexual ones, and that seems to support Mueller's ratchet as a model. Sexual organisms have the potential of purging their genome of deleterious mutations, while at the same time maintaining variability that makes it more difficult for a parasite to spread. Isn't that cool? All right, I tell you what, it is 10:15. I'm willing to give you guys a 15-minute break, but before I do, let me remind you what's coming up. Tomorrow, I do want us to discuss those readings. So if you have not done so already, we've got a reading on eugenics and another reading by Stephen Jay Gould on a particular woman named Carrie Buck, who was forcibly sterilized and was the subject of the Supreme Court's decision that upheld the legality of mandatory sterilization laws. It's widely considered one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in history, although frankly, there's an awful lot to choose from there. Anyway, make sure you do that. Thursday and Friday, I have to miss. What I'm going to do is give you folks 2 labs that you can do on a take-home basis. One for Thursday and one for Friday. That will make up for the fact that we didn't really do a lab this past Thursday. That will make up for that somewhat. Lab 1, I tell you what, I'll actually give you till next week to turn that in because I didn't get the data up until this morning. But the data is in fact up there. You've got a handout with what I want you to do, and you've got all the data that you need to do it, and that's on Blackboard. So yeah, those are the upcoming deadlines, and there's that. Go ahead and take your break, come back at 9:30, and I will see you then, and I will stop the recording.